The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've listened closely to what the Right Honourable Gentleman had to say. At least no one could deny his claim to be an expert in the failures of government. He gave some carefully selected figures of the record of his own government. Let me give a few more. Unemployment more than doubled under his government, from 600,000 to 1.2 million. Output per person rose by less than 3% over the 5 years between 1973 and 1978. Real disposable income per head fell in 1975, 1976 and 1977. And under the Labour government, inflation reached a peak of 27% per annum. In fact, the party he leads presided over the 5 most catastrophic years in Britain's post-war history. Nor is he any person to give lectures on cabinet disarray and disloyalty. Just read what one of his former cabinet colleagues said about him. 4th of December 1968.
Order!
Barbara Castle. I think Jim Callaghan is the most disloyal and damaging member of the whole government. Following year, she says, we'd taken care not to circulate any papers beforehand, knowing our Jim.
That's quite enough. Order! There are two sides in this debate and each... Order! The Leader of the Opposition had a reasonably fair hearing, and the Prime Minister is entitled to the same.
After barely 2 years in office, his party had brought Britain to the brink of total economic collapse. And the country was saved not by his or his party's efforts, but by Tory policies of monetary control and reduced public spending humiliatingly imposed by the International Monetary Fund. And fully supported by my right honourable and honourable friends and me. Mr. Speaker, as the monetary medicine began to work, The right honourable gentleman tried to assign the credit to his incomes policy, which promptly collapsed about his ears as his own lifelong allies, the trade unions, rejected both it and him. And having dithered over calling an election in 1978, he tried to buy off the industrial disruption of last winter and finally succumbed. Today, his party, increasingly infiltrated by people who wish to destroy the mixed economy altogether, advocates a return to the policies of excessive spending and excessive borrowing, which would lead inevitably to another collapse. When I hear the right honourable gentleman doing his best to explain to us the nature of Britain's difficulties and the remedies he proposes, it's plain that he and his policies are part of our problem and they can never be part of the solution. The right honourable gentleman referred to trade union matters, steel, monetary policy, minimum lending rate, earnings, etc. And I will try to deal with these points during the course of what I have to say. But may I first set the magnitude of the problem that we faced in its context. There is general agreement that Britain's problem is basically one of fast inflation since the early 1970s and a rate of economic growth which for the last third of a century at least has been slow in comparison with our competitors. While we were living fairly comfortably in the 1950s, our industries were failing to modernize themselves. Not so in other industrial countries. Faced by the destruction of the war, they were creating an industrial base to suit the needs of the second half of the century. Their industries were building for the future, but too many of ours were still living off their capital and former reputation. During that time, in the 1950s and 60s, we missed out on the rapid economic expansion which characterized the early years of the EEC. It was, Mr. Speaker, a continuous failure to recognize how far and how fast Britain was slipping. Governments planned over-optimistically for increases in public spending, which could only be justified on assumptions about economic growth which were seldom realized. Between 1963 and 1979, public spending as a percentage of GDP grew from 34 to 42%. Civil service expanded from 660,000 to 730,000. The numbers employed by local government leapt from 1.2 million to over 2 million. Resources were drained away from the wealth-creating industry and commerce to the wealth-consuming public sector. Perhaps most significantly of all, the balance of power within our economy shifted as trade unions increasingly used their strength in key industries. The party opposite responded to these problems by putting public expenditure up by 9% over a period when GDP actually fell. Unemployment more than doubled during their stewardship. They legislated to put trade unions above the law. They gave them unprecedented new powers as part of the price for their temporary cooperation. That was the position when Britain voted for a new start and a new government. People wanted a government prepared to face the basic problems realistically. A government which regarded Parliament